We will now proceed with the division on amendment number 1, and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. I call Pam Gossel for a point of order.
Oh, I haven't pressed any.
Thank you, Ms Gossel. We'll assume that you do not require a point of order. Thank you. I call Richard Leonard for a point of order.
I would have voted yes.
Just for clarity, can I confirm, Mr Leonard, that you would have voted
yes?
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll ensure that's recorded. The result of the vote on amendment number 1 in the name of Katie Clark is yes 43, no 70. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. We move on to the next group: exclusions from 40% release point, rehabilitation and targeting repeat offending. I call amendment 2 in the name of Sharon Dowie, grouped with amendments 3, 8 and 9. Sharon Dowie to move amendment 2 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'll speak to the amendments and others in the group. Whilst I and other Scottish Conservative colleagues have been very clear that we are opposed to this bill, especially in the timetable laid out by the Government, if this bill is passed, we must think very carefully about which prisoners we release. My amendments 2 and 8 would exclude prisoners who have refused to participate in a rehabilitation programme from the 40% release point. Rona Mackay said during the Stage 1 debate, if no rehabilitation and preparation for liberty has been undertaken, the people who we release will eventually return to prison through the revolving door. I wholeheartedly agree with Ms Mackay, which is why we should not reward offenders who have resisted efforts to rehabilitate them by releasing them early. If we release a large number of individuals who are likely to reoffend, we will be facing the exact same problem in a few months' time, and the Government will have failed to protect victims of crime. I therefore hope the Government will support my amendments so that those who are likely to reoffend remain behind bars. My colleagues and I will also be supporting Jamie Green's amendments 3 and 9, which seek to add reoffenders to the list of prisoners excluded from this bill's provisions, as it is clear that these individuals require further rehabilitation and support within the prison system.
Can I have you concluded, Ms Dowie?
Concluded, sorry.
Thank you. Can I confirm that you've moved amendment 2?
I moved amendments in my name.
Thank you, Ms Dowie. I now call Jamie Green to speak to amendment 3 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm acutely aware that there are a number of members who probably do not want proceedings to roll to 9 o'clock this evening. I've made my case clear last week at Stage 1, my feelings on why we are rushing this bill through 2 stages in one day. I really hope that the Government and the whole Parliament has listened carefully to the points that we made and what I think is an unnecessary abuse of the emergency procedures of this Parliament. And I think we will discover that over the course of the day. I'm also a realist. I've sat in this chamber many a time, moved many an amendment, to know that probably every one of my amendments will be voted down by the Government today. That's my expectation, and that's disappointing to start a stage 2 in that way. But, you know, I'm willing to be proven wrong, Cabinet Secretary. I've lodged a number of amendments to this bill which seek to improve the bill in any way that I can. The question might be why. It's not my portfolio. I do no longer sit on the Justice Committee. But I did so because I think it was the right thing to do. I think it's the right thing to do. If we see a bill presented to us as members in this place and we're not happy with it, change it. That's what we're here for. And my amendments will seek to do that, and I'll seek to explain the purpose behind them as clearly and concisely as I can. And I'm happy to debate any of them with any member of this Parliament. But I also would say to the Cabinet Secretary, given the way that we are conducting business today in a matter of hours, if for any reason, and I suspect we're going to hear a litany of reasons why my amendments are technically not possible or not feasible, or on some legal basis should not be passed by the Parliament, then I will sit down up the back of this chamber or anywhere else over the next couple of hours with a member of the Government, a Minister, the Cabinet Secretary, her special advisers, her legal advisers or government lawyers, and redraft any of these amendments ahead of stage 3 if it helps. If it helps make them meet the criteria that would make them legally sound to fit into the bill. Because I don't want to hear excuses that these are incompetent amendments. We had to produce them in a matter of hours. What I do want to hear is rationale as to why members should vote against them or vote for them. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. In this grouping, Presiding Officer, Amendments 3 and 9, on a technical level, seek to add reoffenders to the list of prisoners excluded from the provisions of this bill, with Amendment 3 being consequential to Amendment 9. So, in layman's terms, the subject I'm talking about is that of reoffending. Knowing what we now know about what happens when we early release people from prison. It's happened before. We used those powers during COVID, for example. We used them earlier this year when our prisons were full and on the brink of catastrophe. History repeats itself, I would argue. We know that because victims' organisations got in touch with us, all of us, and told us what happened to the victims of crime after people were early released. It is simply my view that if someone's released from prison and find themselves sentenced again within 12 months of release, they should not be eligible for any further early release. It really is as simple as that. It is in a second, it is a point of principle, it is a point of fairness, but it's also a practical proposal, as I am happy to explain. Now, the reason this is important is because the financial memorandum associated with this legislation that we've been asked to pass says that it will directly affect 390 prisoners. Now, that's an estimate, probably a decent one. What we do know is that the last time this Parliament voted to early release people, around 1 in 10 of those people reoffended and found themselves back in prison. I've heard estimates of 1 in 8, actually, but let's, for the sake of fairness, use the 1 in 10 figure. That means immediately, if we support this legislation, we will be creating around 40 reoffenders. That's just a statistical assumption, and probably a fair one. The longer-term purpose of this, though, however, is to reduce the prison population over time. Now, the Government estimates that this bill will reduce it by 5% over time. Now, on a prison population of around 8,500, as it currently sits, that immediately will produce 400 odd reoffenders as a result of our actions today. So I want the Cabinet Secretary and members to think carefully about that. Amendment 9 says that anyone who has been released from prison, having spent that conviction, rightly so, but is then subsequently readmitted into prison within 12 months of their release, having been convicted or sentenced of another crime, will not be eligible for the 2/5 release that this bill proposes. It is, in my view, clear that rehabilitation for that individual has failed during their time in custody. That is evident by the fact that they find themselves back in custody only within 12 months of being released. In what way is further early release going to assist, A, with rehabilitation of the offender, B, reduce any risk of further reoffending, or C, keep the public safe. And as such, that is that argument which I want to press the most, and it is that principle of fairness. Because I think there's an element of people who will be released early from this bill who will see that automatic early release simply as a gift. The sentences are reducing, the deterrent element, and dare I say it, and I will use the word, the punishment element, is being eroded. So there's a strong message to victims here through these amendments that we are on their side. In a similar vein, I will support Sharon Dowie's amendments 2 and 8. And all of these amendments, and I'm happy to give way if the member wants to make a point, all of these amendments go some way to addressing people's concerns about the proposals or the concept of early release. Why? Because there's been no public or stakeholder engagement with them or full government consultation as we normally would see passing a bill. I don't think that this early release proposal will cut. I think it cuts short the rehabilitation proposals, it cuts short alcohol and drug rehabilitation programmes, and it abruptly will place people back in society when they may not be ready, and we know that is the case. We've taken a lot of evidence on that. We also have a responsibility, an overarching one, on bills like this, to do what we can to keep the public safe. And that has to sit at the heart of all the amendments that we debate and discuss today. My amendments go some way in doing that, and I would encourage members to vote for them. Thank you.
I call Maggie Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before I speak to these amendments, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of those who've supported us getting to this point today, specifically and especially those in the LEDGE team. I also am grateful to prison workers and third sector organisations who've been so generous with their time in recent weeks since the announcement by the Cabinet Secretary that this legislation would be introduced. To turn to the amendments in this group, I have a lot of sympathy with Sharon Dowie's amendments, but I have some significant concerns with how they are drafted. Rehabilitation programmes are vital. We know that. We know they can transform people's lives. But all the evidence suggests that in order for them to work, they have to be undertaken on a voluntary basis. Coercing or forcing people into rehab programmes makes those programmes much, much less effective. So I think Sharon Dowie's amendments fall short on that specific point. But I think that there are two other areas as well. Firstly, it's unclear exactly what kinds of programmes would be included in this. In many prisons, there are informal gatherings, informal groupings that actually serve to offer support and, in the longer term, rehabilitation, and it's not clear whether those would be included in these amendments or not. And my final point on Sharon Dowie's amendments is about fairness across the prison sector. In some prisons, some programmes will be offered, and different or no programmes might be offered elsewhere. I don't think it's fair to treat prisoners in different places differently just by virtue of what is or is not offered to them. So we cannot support Sharon Dowie's amendments in this group. On Jamie Green's amendment and repeat offenders, all of the chronological evidence suggests that risk of reoffending is much more likely to be affected by the condition into which people are released and the circumstances in which they are released. And it is so important that we get that right, and his amendments don't address that vital point. So again, we won't be supporting his amendments in this group. Thank you.
Thank you. I call the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Amendments 2 and 8 lodged by Sharon Dowie would have the effect of coercing people into participation in programmes under threat that they will have to spend longer in custody if they do not. I have said repeatedly that one of the problems with the current high population is that it reduces the capacity of the Scottish Prison Service to facilitate purposeful activity and support rehabilitation. And this is essential in preparing individuals for reintegration into the community. I therefore support the availability of rehabilitation programmes and recovery programmes and the range of support provided by the Scottish Prison Service, which help to address the needs of those in custody so they are better equipped to reintegrate into the community post-release. However, participation cannot be compulsory for the simple reason that mandatory participation often does not work. In fact, it can even be dangerous in the cases of substance misuse, where we know that forcing people to engage when they are not ready to do so can exacerbate related health and well-being issues and prolong the substance use challenges. The Scottish Government remains fully behind the importance of rehabilitation work being undertaken in our prisons and communities. However, that work cannot and should not be forced upon people as a means to secure their release from prison custody. While I appreciate the desire to try to promote rehabilitation, this is not the right way to do it, and I would therefore urge Parliament not to support these amendments. Turning to Amendment 3 and 9 in the name of Jamie Green, and if I can just inform Mr Green that I made myself available to every opposition spokesperson in this group, and I was very pleased to say that they all took that opportunity despite our different views on different matters. Mr Green's amendments, as he has articulated, seek to exclude from the release at that 40% point people who have previously re-offended. Now, we, of course, the bigger, broader issues, we need to look at the balance between prison sentences and community justice. Community-based interventions might not be attractive to some, but the evidence tells us that they can be more effective at reducing reoffending than short custodial sentences, and that's why we're investing £148 million in community justice this year, £14 million more than last year. I consider that the proposed exclusions from release at 40% of time served for those serving sentences for domestic abuse and sexual offences, that strikes the right balance. And it is very important to carefully consider the justification for excluding additional groups of people from the changes proposed by the bill and how this would work in practice. The current exclusions have been made very carefully and they've been considered in depth, and I will be bringing forward at stage 3 an amendment on a technical point to ensure that the bill captures every case in which these exclusions should apply to a short-term prisoner. But I do not think it's appropriate to begin including new offences where the same justification may not apply. In particular, the amendment I will be bringing forward at stage 3 will ensure that in event that a prisoner who has been sentenced to under 4 years and is currently serving that sentence out with the UK is transitioned into a Scottish prison, and that sentence is for the equivalent of a sexual or domestic abuse offence, they will definitely be excluded from the change in release point and instead continue to be released at the halfway point. Of course.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary. It's an intervention. Gently, can I inquire why that amendment's not available here at stage 2 for us to debate within the remit of the other amendments that have been lodged?
Cabinet Secretary.
Because the reality is, Mr Whitfield, that given the crisis and the severity of the situation in our prisons, we are all working at pace, and that's why I have brought forward emergency legislation, and I will make the information available to you, sir, at the earliest possible point. But I did, at this earliest point, wanted to highlight this very important matter, albeit a technical one. Presiding Officer, I raise these matters to emphasise the complexities involved in considering potential exclusions from the change to the release point, and the need to very carefully consider the implications. And I do not think that on this occasion that Jamie Green has done that. He has not done that in the same way that justification has been made for excluding those who are serving sentences for domestic abuse or sexual offences. Differentiated treatment requires very clear evidence in its justification. The other point I would like to raise is that at the point of sentencing, the court has every opportunity when it passes sentence to take into account someone's offending history and any matters around repeat offending. Presiding Officer, if Mr Green believes that this amendment would reduce reoffending, that this is not supported by the available evidence, the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research, in the response to the Criminal Justice Committee's call for views on my parliamentary statement on the 10th of October, outlining these proposals stated, and I quote, "We are not aware of empirical evidence in Scotland or internationally that this small change in the timing of release will have a significant adverse effect in terms of reoffending. Rather, the weight of criminological evidence suggests that risk of reoffending is much more likely to be affected by the condition in which people are released and the circumstances to which they are released," a point very well made by Maggie Chapman. And I therefore, Presiding Officer, with respect, do not support the amendments in the name of Jamie Green, and I would ask members not to support them.
Thank you. And I call on Sharon Dowie to wind up and to press or withdraw Amendment 2.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm obviously disappointed that the opposition parties are not going to support the amendments. I've got concerns for victims of crime, with people getting released early without full rehabilitation. On Maggie Chapman's point that we may have been able to do further drafting if we had more time. So that's my concern about the fact that the bill is going through so quickly. If we'd had more time, we might have been able to do further drafting to make the amendment more acceptable. But in the amendment, it does say, having been offered the opportunity to participate in a rehabilitation programme. It doesn't say that you've been coerced or you've been forced to do it. It's somebody who's been offered the opportunity during the prisoner's imprisonment has refused to participate. So again, that begs the question, do people go into prison and they can just refuse any rehabilitation and then they will then be given the reward of leaving early? So had we been given more time, we could possibly have done further drafting, but I will be pushing the motion in my name. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Dowie. The question is that Amendment 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 2 in the name of Sharon Dowie is yes 26, no 71. There were 20 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And I call amendment 3 in the name of Jamie Green, already debated with amendment 2. Jamie Green, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that amendment 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 3 in the name of Jamie Green is yes 48, no 71. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And we move on to the next group. Release at 40% point, subject to community payback order. I call amendment 4 in the name of Jamie Green, grouped with amendments 5 and 11. Jamie Green to move amendment 4 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Government has stated that we are pushing through this bill today as an emergency bill because there is an emergency. The emergency stated is that our prisons are full. The Cabinet Secretary just a few minutes ago used the word crisis. So we need to cut sentence lengths to achieve that prisoner and prisoner staff safety that was talked about at stage 1. Now, whether you agree with that or not is another debate. My feelings of that are well known. But even if you think that is the case, and this is the way to achieve it, and that this is the tool we should be using to keep our prisons safer places by reducing numbers, it doesn't necessarily make it fair or right. It's simply the mechanism by which we're being asked to reduce prison numbers. It's a blunt instrument, actually. It achieves the different goal of the question as whether the sentencing itself is fair. Fair on victims, fair on the public, and in some cases fair on the offenders themselves. And I simply want to restore some balance in this debate that we're having. My amendments in this group, 4, 5 and 11, offer some balance, and I think they offer the public some compromise, which is that yes, the Parliament may vote to release prisoners early to free up space in those prisons. But we also will do so, and in doing so, ensure that the public have faith in the justice system, that sentencing is still fair and proportionate and still delivers justice for all. Amendment 5 requires that a prisoner serves the remainder of that time, that is, the difference between the 40% and 50% of their sentence, by completing a community payback order for that proportion of the sentence. Amendment 11 defines what a community payback order is, and it's defined along the same lines as the Criminal Procedure Scotland Act 1995. Amendment 5 is a consequential to the above. Essentially, that means that if someone is released early from prison, if that reason is to keep the prison population down, they are still able to give something back to the communities that they have harmed and still continue on their path of rehabilitation back into society outside of the doors of prison. This, for me, simply is a matter of fairness and of public perception of what we are doing today. I see it difficult how people could argue against this, because the government themselves believe that community sentences, in their own parlance, are meaningful and useful alternatives to custody. In that respect, I see no problem with including that element in the reduced sentences that we're being asked to pass today. I look forward to hearing the feedback from other members and indeed the Cabinet Secretary.
Just confirming you're moving the amendment, Mr Green.
Amendment 4 moved.
Yeah, moving. Thank you. I call Fulton McGregor.
I've got real concerns about this amendment. I think it gives much more questions than answers. For example, who would be imposing the community payback order? Presumably a court. At what time would it be imposed? Does the person need to reappear at court? And what are the impacts on the courts if that's the case, which is really the only way I can see it happening? Because we must remember, Presiding Officer, a community payback order is in itself a sentence, and a very serious one. The amendment to me, and I'm sure Jamie Green hasn't meant it in this way, because it is emergency legislation and he's had only a short time to pull amendments together, but it does feel like it's in the mould of the Tories' general attitude to community sentences. That is to say, custody is best, but listen, if we can't get custody, just let's put people on community payback orders. As I say, I'm sure that's not what the member intended, But to me, it is very disrespectful to the court processes, minimises the purpose of what a community payback order is and what it's meant to do, and seriously downplays the role of those who carry out the orders with offenders as more of a mere add-on or an addendum to the justice system, an afterthought. So, Presiding Officer, I can't support this, and I'd be surprised if any other party across the chamber supports it as well.
Thank you. I call Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I am very pleased that Jamie Green recognises the value of community payback orders, which offer a robust and effective alternative to custody. Encouraging more widespread use of community payback orders where appropriate, particularly as an alternative to short prison sentences, is a key part of our ambition to shift the balance between the use of custody and justice in the community. However, these amendments are not the way to achieve that balance, nor are they an appropriate way to manage the release process. There are also fundamental issues with what is being proposed through these amendments. Community payback orders are a sentence in their own right, imposed by the independent courts as a direct alternative to custody, and after having taken into account all the facts and circumstances of each individual case. They are not intended to be used as these amendments propose, which is clear from the existing legislation governing their use, legislation which this Parliament agreed. It is entirely unclear who would actually impose the community payback order, a point just made by Fulton McGregor, how many hours of unpaid work would be undertaken, or how existing statutory requirements would be met, including ensuring that unpaid work is suitable, having had regard to justice social work reports, or that the individual in question understands and agrees to comply with the order. Critically, existing legislation explicitly specifies that community payback orders are not to be imposed alongside custody for the same offence. And I'm happy to take Ms McNeill's intervention.
Polly McNeill.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I thought the points that Fulton McGregor made were extremely valid, and as you're making now, it was to show the importance of a Stage 1 report where we might have had time to examine the differences, the important differences in structure, if you like, of how you treat prisoners and offenders. But does the Cabinet Secretary maybe appreciate where Jamie Green might be coming from? Because I have some sympathy with that, which is that we're letting prisoners out 10% early, 40% through their sentence, with no supervision unless the court had previously applied that. And that is there another way in which those offenders who are going to be released early can find some way of supervising, given the, I think, the legitimate concern the public would have about that?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I very much understand the point that Ms McNeill and indeed that Mr Green makes. And the crux of the issue, as indeed Ms McNeill articulated, is that right now all short-term prisoners, released at the 50% point of their sentence, are released unconditionally unless at the time of sentencing the court has imposed an extended sentence or indeed a supervised release order, or if someone is subjected to sex offender notification. Everybody else is released unconditionally and automatically, and that would be the same for those released at the 40% point. And although these issues, they're not insignificant, but there is an important point of principle in terms of these amendments. And that is that what we can't get away from is that we should not be requiring the blanket imposition of a second sentence, which takes no account of individual circumstances and may not even involve the courts on those leaving custody. Where I think Ms McNeill and indeed Mr Green touch on something very important. That is about the importance of employability and getting people into purposeful activity, whether that's work or some other type of activity that helps to improve their skills and their connectivity and location in the community. And where the bill helps with this in a broad sense is that if we reduce the population, we can therefore increase the focus and the work on meaningful activity within our prisons, whether that's education, skills and employment. And if I can just take the opportunity to remind those in Chamber who might not be aware of the various partnerships that the Scottish Prison Service has with the private sector to support people into work on release. And actually it's something that both myself and the Deputy First Minister have taken a very keen interest and are planning some new work with this regard. So I think we are all in agreement about the point of the importance of work and improving people's journeys into work. But unfortunately, Presiding Officer, both in principle and for practical reasons, I cannot support these amendments and urge Parliament to vote against them.
Thank you. And I now call on Jamie Green to wind up. Press to withdraw Amendment 4. Mr Green.
Can I thank members for their contributions? I think it's good to air these matters in the limited time we have. Just to respond to some of the points made briefly, members are right to raise questions about the fact that my amendment probably raises more questions than it does answer through the practicalities, if it were to pass, around CPOs, the issue of how many hours that people would serve, who would oversee that. Would it be local authorities? Would it be social justice partners? But Pauline McNeill answers that question rightly by saying all of this would have been aired properly through consultation, through evidence giving, and through what I suspect would have been a very robust Stage 1 report, of which I have a lot of faith in the members of that committee who would have written it. So these are all issues that could have been answered properly if we had time to do it properly. But there is a fundamental issue is that, and I say this in response to Fulton McGregor, I do believe that community sentencing has its place. I value it. I think other people do as well. That's not the point of argument here. But what is a problem? And he mentions that these amendments are, I think the words used were disrespectful to the courts. What is disrespectful to the courts is when a judge has passed a sentence, but then this Parliament decides months or years later to alter the lengths of those sentences after the decisions have been made by the so-called independent judges in courts. That's disrespectful to the courts, not my amendments today. In a second, Cabinet Secretary. I want to make the point that, yes, community sentence does have a place, and it has a place in that it does assist with the interaction with offenders in wider society. They're not in custody, therefore there needs to be a different way of monitoring them. And that's a point that Pauline McNeill rightly made. What is lacking in this bill is that by releasing people early, with the reservations that we and the public and victims' organisations have, is there's nothing in this bill that offers any further comfort that those offenders will be managed or supervised or assisted in any way once they are released. And I'm happy to give way to the Cabinet Secretary.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, it was just to put to Mr Green a very important factual point and point of clarification that it is entirely within the gift of ministers and in no way interrupts or interferes with the independence of our courts and judiciary. It has been the case at least since 1993 that ministers can take action of this type, and indeed previous and current UK governments have done likewise.
Jamie Green.
Oh, I hear the Cabinet Secretary, but in my view it doesn't make it right. I'm deeply uncomfortable with ministers rushing through bills to release people early, because at the end of the day a judge has given somebody a sentence, 10-year sentence, expecting them to serve 5. Well, that's being eroded. It's a matter of fact. It is being altered through the actions of ministers and ergo this Parliament. So we are interfering and meddling, whether we like it or not. We can change the language around it, but that is what is happening. And that is what makes me uncomfortable. And if we are going to do that, and there are wider societal debates around sentencing and their role and the fairness of them, then let's have those debates, but let's do it properly. And we haven't done that. I move the amendment.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament's not agreed. There will be a vote and members should cast their votes now. And the vote is now closed. And the result of the vote on amendment number 4 in the name of Jamie Green is yes 48, no 71. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Call amendment number 5 in the name of Jamie Green, already debated with amendment 4. Jamie Green, to move or not move?
Not moved.
It's not moved. Move to exclusions from 40% release point offence against emergency workers. I call amendment 6 in the name of Jamie Green, in a group on its own. Jamie Green to move and speak to amendment 6. Mr Green.
Cabinet Secretary be relieved. This is the last time you should probably hear from me till the final grouping on this debate. It's another amendment I've included. It's been put in a group of its own, I think rightly so. I want to cast members, I know some are going for a cup of tea, I won't speak for long on this one. When the Fireworks and Pyrotechnics Articles Bill came to stage 3 in this Parliament, those of us who remember that bill, one thing I was really pleased about was that we were united as a Parliament in our commitment to the safety of emergency workers as they go about their business in keeping us safe. We're not long out of the season where a number of our blue light services were horrifically attacked again over the course of fireworks and bonfire night and that period. And year after year we hear of these, and I think we all, it goes without saying that we all condemn such attacks. But one of the things I was most pleased about that legislation was that we were unanimous in supporting one of my proposals to that bill at stage 3, which was to add an aggravator to the bill, which effectively says that those who use fireworks as a weapon against emergency workers would require courts to impose a harsher punishment on those offences than normal attacks. That was just 2 years ago, and I think that was a strong message. We stand steadfast in our support for those emergency workers. They put their lives on the line every day of the year. What I'm asking Parliament to do in respect to this early release bill is do the same again. Amendment 6 is a short and simple amendment. It excludes those convicted of an offence under the Emergency Workers Scotland Act 2005 from being automatically early released at 40% of the way through their sentence, instead requiring that they complete the current status quo, in their case 50% of their sentence. Now, in my personal view, I would prefer individuals convicted under that piece of legislation to serve their sentence alongside those which the government has chosen to exclude from this bill, such as those convicted of domestic abuse, for example, because I put the gravity of the sentence on the same level, and it is for that reason that they should not be eligible for earlier release. Arguably, they should serve longer sentences, but that is an argument for another day. I hope the Parliament will join me today in sending a crystal clear message to all our emergency service workers that attacks on them will not be tolerated, they will not be taken lightly, and that those convicted of such attacks will not benefit from early release. End of. Thank you.
Mr Green, can I confirm you're moving the amendment? Thank you. And I call the Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I most certainly agree with absolutely everything that has been said about our hard-working and dedicated emergency workers. I know the commitment that thousands of people on the front line of our emergency services provide day in, day out to keep us all safe and to respond to our needs, and that we all absolutely appreciate everything that they do. I am sorry to say to Mr Green that I cannot support his amendment today. The change being made by this bill is to the standard release point going forward, and it is therefore important, for reasons I've already outlined in an earlier group, to carefully consider the justification for excluding people who are not currently excluded from the existing process. I consider that the proposed exclusions for those serving sentences for domestic abuse and sexual offences strikes the right balance by providing a proportionate way to address some of the historic barriers to reporting which can arise in relation to those offences. And it's for those reasons that I cannot support the amendment in Mr Green's name.
Thank you. I call on Jamie Green to wind up. Press or withdraw Amendment 6. Mr Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I agree with the exclusions that the Government have proposed. I'd like to see more, but those sentences of domestic abuse or serious sexual crimes should be excluded from this early release. It can be done. It proves that we can exclude certain categories of offenders from this early release bill, and I'm pleased to see some of them in there. But my inclusion of emergency service workers is one of, again, out of fairness to them. All I would say is that the Cabinet Secretary goes about her business as Justice Secretary, has to meet many of these stakeholders, the fire service, police, ambulance, and look them in the eye. And she will need to explain to them why she votes down this amendment. I don't have to do that.
And you're pressing the amendment, Mr Green. Thank you. The question is that Amendment 6 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. And the vote is now closed. And the result of the vote on Amendment 6 in the name of Jamie Green is yes 51, no 67. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call Amendment 7 in the name of Katie Clark, already debated with Amendment 1. Pauline McNeill to move or not move?
Not moved.
That is not moved. I call Amendment 8 in the name of Sharon Dowie, already debated with Amendment 2. Sharon Dowie to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 8 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. And the vote is now closed. Point of order, Michael Mara. Could we have Michael Mara's microphone, please?
Sorry, Presiding Officer. I've tried to connect, couldn't. I would have abstained.
Thank you, Mr Mara. I'll make sure that vote is recorded. And the result of the vote on amendment number 8 in the name of Sharon Dowie is yes 29, no 71. There were 20 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 9 in the name of Jamie Green, already debated with amendment 2. Jamie Green, to move or not move?
Not moved.
That is not moved. We move to victim notification of automatic early release. I call amendment 10 in the name of Pauline McNeill, grouped with amendments 17, 20, 26. Pauline McNeill to move amendment 10 and speak to all the amendments in the group. Ms McNeill.
Amendment 10 has the effect that Scottish ministers must notify any person who is or appears to be a victim in relation to the offence of the date of the prisoner's release for those short-term prisoners affected by the bill. Amendment 17, the effect of that, the regulations must provide for Scottish ministers to notify any person who is or appears to be a victim in relation to the offence of the date of the prisoner's release. And Amendment 20, Scottish ministers must make a statement to the Parliament setting out improvements that have been made to the victim notification scheme in respect of prisoners to be released by virtue of the regulation. So the current bill proposed to use the same mechanism to contact victims as was used in the previous emergency early release measures, where only 2% of victims were contacted, the of course meaning 98% were not. Victim Support Scotland is calling for legislation to allow victim support organisations to proactively notify people impacted by crime, thereby removing the onus for victims to identify themselves and come forward for support. So I think it's a really important grouping in the sense that if the Parliament does pass this legislation to allow offenders to be released early, then very important, we must make sure that is provision for victims to be properly notified previous arrangements were not good enough. I think that also the Amendment 26 in the name of Sharon Dowie is also really important, and we will be supporting that amendment to ensure that there is proper scrutiny over these arrangements. Thank you.
And you're moving the amendment?
In my name.
Thank you. I call Sharon Dowie to speak to Amendment 26 and the other amendments in the group. Ms Dowie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm supportive of Pauline McNeill's amendments 10, 17 and 20 in the group. My Amendment 26 is more specific, so as to definitively include young offenders. Youth crime continues to be an issue in Scotland, and we've recently seen a concerning trend of antisocial behaviour occurring, particularly by youth taking advantage of free bus transport. Cases like that of Keith Rawlinson, who was killed by a 15-year-old boy, exemplify why we cannot take this issue lightly. My amendment, of course, also covers adult offenders. After the SNP's wave of prisoner releases in the summer, it was reported in September that fewer than 20 victims were notified, whilst 477 prisoners were released. This cannot happen again. Therefore, my amendment would require the Scottish Government to notify victims of any early releases resulting from this bill, whether they be adult offenders or children. And I move the motion.
Thank you, Ms Dowie. And I call Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I intend to speak to these amendments in this group in relation to the Child Rights and Wellbeing Impact Assessment for Prisoner Early Release Scotland Bill, which was issued in November 2024. And I do so, and will do so in other groups, into relation to the three areas that young people are affected by this. Those, in this case, where young people are indeed the victims of an offence. In other amendments, it's where the young person themselves may well be an offender. And then there is another group of young children who are related to offenders who will be released. I am, and I say this with no joy, quite disappointed in the Child Rights Wellbeing Impact Assessment that has been conducted on this matter, And I understand that there will be an explanation, obviously, of the urgency of time in relation to this. But in respect of these amendments that deal with how victims are going to be handled and how the voyage and knowledge and support they will get, I am particularly disappointed because, as the Cabinet Secretary and those in this chamber will be aware, Article 3.1 of the UNCRC says we must always act in the best interests of the child. And in this case, the child that I'm talking about, Deputy Presiding Officer, is obviously those who have been victims of an offence. The impact assessment goes on to talk about the wide range of published material on children that was used by the government to come to its conclusions. It also makes reference to the shortened consultation that took place. Although it does point out that actually the input in relation to children was very small because very few people who contributed to that or were approached about that actually dealt with children themselves as victims. Indeed, the contributions from Children First and Families Outside pointed to the fact that for Children First, they highlighted the risk of changing the point of release for prisoners and is damaging to the trust for victims. And this trust is in relation to children and young people who are at the process of developing their trust in society and community. They are developing their trust in the structures that perhaps some of us take for granted. And yet again, they will experience one where they feel let down because, you know, without that support, without learning to trust the systems, it is very hard in later life to then rely upon them. I am particularly concerned, I'm particularly concerned in relation to the questions asked of the government about is there any negative impact on these children? And very specifically, as victims of crime, it concluded this may have a negative impact on children's rights as set out in UNCRC Article 3, the best. It's typed as wishes, but obviously it's the best interests of the child. The government then is required to say what it is going to do in relation to that. And the suggestions that have been put forward are, at their very strongest, very weak in relation to where children are victims of the child. So having identified them, that it's having negative impacts. The conclusions that have been reached, the support that's been put out there, contained within this document, is quite frankly non-existent. The potential negative impact has been identified. Non-discrimination in terms of exclusions to the change and release point are noted. The strongest is that there are therefore already legal avenues for children to be released at any point in their sentence, regardless of the type of offence, and for support to be given. And then finally, at the end, there is a request as to what post-assessment review and sign-off is taking place. And the government has offered the strong suggestion that they will just continue to engage. So within this assessment, it is disappointing that the government cannot set out specifically what additional and proper support is being given in the case of these current amendments to support for young people and children who are the victims of crime, who the government have identified the consequences of this bill will be negative. Under the circumstances, I will be supporting the amendments in this group. I'm grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I call the Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I have said throughout this process that I am well aware and entirely understand the concerns that victims and their families will have about this bill. That is why we are already working with victim support organisations and providing them with clear information about the bill. I want to also reiterate that this bill makes no changes to how victims who have signed up for the Victim Notification Scheme or the Victim Information Scheme will continue to receive information about the prisoner in their case. Let me first speak to Pauline McNeill's Amendments 10 and 17 and Sharon Dowie's Amendment 26, which would place a duty on Scottish ministers to provide information related to prisoners' release to victims, even when that is not wanted. Sharon Dowie's amendment would apply in relation to the initial tranches of release, and Pauline McNeill's amendments would apply in an ongoing manner. The effect of these amendments would compel Scottish ministers to provide information related to liberation of prisoners to victims, whether they are signed up to the Victim Notification Scheme or not. This means that victims will be notified even when they have not consented to being contacted. The amendments would also significantly increase complexity by introducing new schemes in relation to these cases, which would operate completely differently to the existing scheme. Presiding Officer, the Victim Notification Scheme, or VNS, is an opt-in system that provides victims of crime with information about the release of offenders currently detained in prison. This is designed to ensure that victims retain control of the information they wish to receive or not. I encourage all victims to sign up to the VNS so they can receive information about the release of the prisoner in their case. We are working with victim support organisations to ensure victims are supported in understanding how the scheme operates and how they can sign up to it. A recent considered and significant review of VNS looked at the current registration process for the scheme and weighed the benefits and risks of an opt-in versus an opt-out system. The report concluded that automatic enrolment in the scheme would not make the experience trauma-informed and emphasised that, and I quote, the system should be based on choice and consent on registration. The report recommended the adoption of a system of automatic referral of all eligible victims to a new specific victim contact team that would ensure a supported discussion of how the scheme operates in order to allow victims to take an informed decision as to whether to join the scheme. This fits with what victims tell us about the crucial importance of informed choice where possible through the criminal justice system, and enables victims to maintain control and agency when it comes to how and when they receive information and respects their rights to data protection. The Scottish Government has committed to this reform and the vast majority of the other recommendations, and as members know, we plan to use Victims, Witnesses and Justice Reform Bill to make the legislative changes we need. Yes, of course.
Maggie Chapman.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking an intervention. Can she say a little bit more, perhaps? She's outlined the distinction between an opt-in system, which is what we currently have, and an opt-out system, which is what these amendments would do. The Scottish Greens aren't minded to support these amendments, but we would be grateful if you could say a little bit more about the work underway to improve the victim notification scheme, because there are people who have slipped through the cracks even though they have opted in. Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I won't repeat what I've said about the Independent Victim Notification Scheme review and how myself and my Minister will take forward those amendments at stage 2 at the Victims, Witness and Justice Reform Bill. That would be an early opportunity to make progress on those recommendations. There is another, there is another important strand of work in all of this, and that's in relation to the Victims Task Force, which I chair along with the Lord Advocate. And while we sometimes get into a debate that presents opt-in or opt-out in a very binary way, actually, I think the reality is different. So the work that the Victims Task Force is taking forward, while that might be labelled as a move towards an opt-out system, but at its core, it still has choice and personal agency at it. So there will be further improvements, both in terms of our legislative response to the independent review of the Victim Notification Scheme, but also in terms of that work of the Victims Task Force, which has now moved to its next stage. And I'm very supportive of the work that the Victims Task Force is doing, and I'm happy to give way to Mr Whitfield.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. And in the light of that, with the work that's ongoing, can she confirm that the situation which exists at the moment, that a child under 12 will not receive information under either of the two statutory schemes for the provision of information for their victims in their own right, rather it will fall to a parent and carer, that may indeed be looked at, both in forthcoming legislation, but also, more importantly, with regard to the task force?
Cabinet Secretary.
So, Presiding Officer, let me give Mr Whitfield an undertaking. We are, of course, right now operating within the confines of the current Victim Notification Scheme and the current VIS. But I will give him an undertaking that I will personally engage with the relevant children's organisations prior to stage 2 of the Victims Witness Justice Reform, and particularly bearing in mind the valuable work that the Victims Task Force is doing. Presiding Officer, can I just say I also recognise the critical role of safety planning for victims. That is why we will work closely with the Scottish Prison Service and victim support organisations to develop a multi-agency working group to raise awareness of existing rights to notification on release, and to ensure that we adopt an appropriately targeted approach to identifying victims who are likely to be impacted by this bill and understanding what support they are likely to require. We will also work with victim support organisations and the Prison Service to maintain the information sharing processes established earlier this year under the Bail and Release from Custody Act, which enables victim support organisations to request information on behalf of victims where the victim has nominated them to do so. We believe this is a more person-centred and trauma-informed approach to communicating with victims, which upholds their right to information and minimises the risk of re-traumatisation. We fully understand victims' right to information and the importance of this. However, this should not come at the expense of being able to exercise agency and choice and rights to data protection. Therefore, while I appreciate there may be very good intentions behind these amendments, I do urge Parliament not to support them. Next, Presiding Officer, turn to Amendment 20, lodged by Pauline McNeill, MSP. This amendment would require a statement to Parliament setting out improvements that have been made to the Victim Notification Scheme every time the regulations under Section 3 are used to change the release point of a specific group of prisoners. As I have just mentioned before, the Scottish Government has started work on reforms to the VNS. I welcome the opportunity to provide the Parliament with updates on the wide range of work we are undertaking to improve the VNS and victims' rights more widely, and have committed to provide Parliament with an annual report on the progress of these reforms. However, this amendment would require the making of a statement every time this power is used, and this could include instances when even small changes are made using the power, and as is in primary legislation, it would remain in place long after the improvements to VNS are made. I do understand, though, that it will be very important to consider how any changes made under these regulations may impact victims, and that plans should be put in place to ensure victims can access information, and for Parliament to hear direct from the Cabinet Secretary for Justice. Therefore, I am happy to offer to work with Pauline McNeill on an amendment for Stage 3 that reflects that shared desire, alongside a similar suggestion from Sharon Dowie in Group 8, and I therefore ask members not to support this amendment.
Thank you. I call on Pauline McNeill to wind up. Press the withdrawal amendment 10. Ms McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. So first of all, as I said in my opening remarks, only 2% of victims were contacted, and that did seem extremely low, so hence the reason for putting this amendment to explore what more can be done. I do welcome the Cabinet Secretary's very detailed answer to that about how we can promote the scheme to ensure that more people do enrol in the first place. So I do acknowledge that. But both myself and Sharon Dowie in the same grouping are very keen that Parliament should get full sight of the changes as they progress, because, as expressed in previous groups, the major concern of the bill, of course, is that we're going to be releasing prisoners earlier, and if the government gets the power for long-term prisoners, all the more reason why we need to improve the victim notification scheme in relation to the release of long-term prisoners. So we need to get this right. In view of that, I'd be content to work with Sharon Dowie and Cabinet Secretary in the short time available to see if we can get something in Stage 3 that would deflect everyone's concerns. Thank you. I therefore ought to move.
You anticipated my next question. Pauline McNeill seeks to withdraw Amendment 10. Does any member object? No member objects. Therefore, Amendment 10 is withdrawn. I call Amendment 11 in the name of Jamie Green, already debated with Amendment 4. Jamie Green, to move or not move?
Not moved.
That is not moved. And we move to no changes to current automatic early release point. I call Amendment 12 in the name of Liam Kerr, group with Amendments 15, 25, 27, 28, 29 and 30. Liam Kerr to move Amendment 12 and speak to the other amendments in the group. Mr Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My amendments in this group are simple. The operative ones, upon which the others hang, are Amendments 12 and 15, which would remove the provisions automatically releasing short-sentence prisoners after serving only 40% of their sentence. Presiding Officer, we all appreciate the size of the prison population, but as previous knee-jerk releases have shown, freeing hundreds of criminals without a wider plan, without accompanying considerations which are wholly absent from this bill, does nothing to address the capacity issues in the medium and long term. What it does do, of course, as we've been told by many authorities, is potentially jeopardise public safety, create and re-traumatise victims and load pressure onto other agencies. Now, if the government's real intent were a short, sharp release of pressure, they would have put in some kind of sunset clause or done it as a one-off. But this bill seeks a permanent, irreversible, wholesale change to sentencing without proper scrutiny, without proper evidence of the consequences, and without proper evidence consideration of the alternatives. And all this with only 5 working days since we got sight of the bill and 2 days formal consideration. And as many members have pointed out already today, absent a proper committee report. By including powers such as these in Section 1 and 2, the government risks compromising our justice system, victim security and public safety. My amendments in this group seek to prevent that, and I move them accordingly.
Thank you, Mr Kerr. I now call Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer. I won't take as much time as I did last time, but again, to go back to the document previously referred to, which is the government's assessment in relation to the effect. What we're looking at now are children and young people who are going to be released early. And I would seek confirmation from the Cabinet Secretary in her contribution that the reason for this is not in relation to the imprisonment or otherwise of children, whether it should or should not happen. It's because that if children are excluded from early release, there will be therefore an unfair burden on children and young people because they are in prison, and as such, if they had been older, they would have been released earlier. When we look at the work that has been done in the document submitted with regard to the effect on the UNCRC, the government accept that there is not a stressed situation in children and young people's secure accommodation the way there is with adult accommodation. And indeed, they very specifically say that there is not the pressures on secure accommodation that exist, and it is only because of that earlier matter that I articulated that children are being included in this. And of course, the current legislation means that courts are only permitted to impose periods of detention for children if it considers that no other method of dealing with that individual is appropriate. And I would invite the Cabinet Secretary to articulate why, if the only avenue that has been open to a court is detention of a young person, how that sits with the argument that because older people may be released under an automatic release scheme, it would be unfair on a child and young person not to release them. Because if the case is that they should have not been detained in the first place, they should not have been in any detention for the start. So some of the arguments that have been articulated earlier about the consideration that judges and those that impose detention really come back into this, but not in the same way as they did last time, because what this bill is seeking to do is to say, even though very, very few young people are remanded or on detention, the only ones that are because specifically that is the only option that works in that case. However, this Parliament, this government, are proposing to make it fair because older people are being released, then younger people should be released on the same calculation. I'm grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I now call the Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, to start by answering Mr Whitfield's point directly, it is my view and it is my strong view that we can't have our children disadvantaged in comparison to adults. We are, of course, all under a UNCRC obligation, and, of course, I repeat my commitment that I made to him earlier about engaging with the children's organisations, whether they're organisations that are supporting the welfare and advocating for the rights of children, or whether they are organisations that are representing child victims. And, of course, some of these organisations work across all of these issues. If I can also say to Mr Kerr, I have every opportunity when I've made a parliamentary statement on the issue of prison population. There's been a number over the past year or so. I have always spoke of the need of that wider plan, both in terms of prevention, in terms of how we support families and how we support our children, how we keep young people in particular out of the criminal justice system, how we eradicate poverty in this country, but also of that need for that systems-wide approach in the justice system. And I won't, for brevity, Presiding Officer, I won't go over every action that is in that preventative field, or indeed the actions that we will need to take in the future, both in terms of the medium and the longer term. But what I am focused on right now is what we have to do right now. This doesn't preclude further action in the medium to longer term, and indeed there are further necessary steps that we must take. But if I could quote the correspondence that I've received from the Prisoner Officers Association, when they say we are supportive of the aims of the bill, our support for the bill is caveated by the fact that we recognise it is a step in the right direction, and it is a necessary step for now. But I do say to Parliament, it is but only one step. Presiding Officer, the effect of Mr Kerr's amendments 12, 15, 25, 27, 28, 29 and 30 collectively would be to prevent the bill from having any immediate effect. And while no amendment is individually a wrecking amendment in terms of standing orders, it is my view that collectively these amendments are intended to wreck the purpose of the bill. And I've always said that doing nothing right now is not an option. And if I had to characterise the nature of the amendments collectively in Group 6 would be the do nothing right now option. And we don't have that option right now, Presiding Officer, because the bill does form part of a range of actions that we are taking to sustainably reduce the prison population. And I have set out why changes are needed now to relieve pressures on the prison estate. And I know that opposition spokespersons have also heard direct from the Scottish Prison Service Chief Executive, Theresa Medhurst, last week on the pressures that prison staff are facing. And this has also been stated by the Prison Governors Association in their correspondence to the Criminal Justice Committee. And I therefore urge members to support the Scottish Prison Service and not to support the amendments in the name of Mr Kerr.
Thank you. I call on Liam Kerr to wind up. Press or withdraw Amendment 12. Mr Kerr.
Yeah, I'm grateful, Presiding Officer. And I'm grateful particularly for the very reasoned comments of Martin Whitfield and for the Cabinet Secretary's willingness to engage in the debate. I recognise, of course, Cabinet Secretary, that the Cabinet Secretary recognises the need for wider strategies and drivers of the prison population. But to my mind, that is what makes this tactic, this bill, even more inexplicable in its terms. And I'm afraid I don't accept that the Cabinet Secretary has made out the argument from necessity, as has been put forward by many colleagues, but particularly Jamie Green in the Stage 1 debate the other day. Yes, of course, Cabinet Secretary, it has its supporters among the services, of course, because that's about relieving the huge pressure that they are under and the extremely hard work that we all accept that they put in. What they need, though, is wider solutions that will work in the medium term and the longer term. Presiding Officer, I would never seek to simply wreck legislation. I think the Cabinet Secretary knows me better than that. My worry is what might be wrecked by this legislation, and for that reason I move Amendment 12.
Thank you, Mr Quire. The question is that Amendment 12 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. And the vote is now closed. And the result of the vote on Amendment 12 in the name of Liam Kerr is yes 48, no 70. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. We turn to publication of information on support plans. I call Amendment 13 in the name of Pauline McNeill, grouped with Amendments 14, 18 and 19. Pauline McNeill to move Amendment 13 and speak to all the other amendments in the group. Ms McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I regard these set of amendments as a really vital part of the discussion, not just for the bill, but the wider discussion on how we support prisoners on release. Amendment 13 deals with the management of the integration of short-term prisoners by local authorities. Amendment 14 is the extension of automatic early release for certain short-term prisoners and access to housing. Amendment 18 is about the reintegration of prisoners. Scottish Ministers must publish their plans to support local authorities in managing the reintegration of prisoners released by virtue of the regulations. And Amendment 19, for making regulations, Scottish Ministers must publish their plans to support prisoners released by virtue of the regulations with access to housing, health and rehabilitation support. As the Parliament has previously debated, one of the essential issues, particularly in relation to short-term prisoners, is the revolving door and the tendency for those offenders to re-offend. Of course, it's pertinent in the wider debate, but this is a perfect opportunity, while we're dealing with this emergency legislation, to ensure that we are making provision for offenders who are released into the community, many of whom would not be back in prison if they had the right support, particularly in relation to their housing and their medical needs. I therefore would hope that Scottish Ministers will give a very positive welcome to at least the content of these amendments. If not, I'm sure the potential redrafting of them to make sure that they are competent for Stage 3. But I really think this is a really important aspect of the debate.
Thank you, Ms McNeill. I call the Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I would like to very much thank Pauline McNeill for her comments and continuing support and interest in those public and third sector services that are essential to meet the needs of individuals as they are released from custody. We all recognise the need for our public and third sector services to be able to engage with individuals whilst they are in custody, working in coordination with prisons to identify and plan for the support they will need after release. This is achieved through cooperation and coordination of justice services and the mainstream public services that will meet each individual's needs, whether that's for housing, healthcare benefits or other assistance. This coordinated approach, inspired by the proposals agreed in the Bail and Release from Custody Scotland Act 2023, the Act sets out a wide aim to help align the broad range of justice, public and third sector services through the duty to engage in pre-release planning and the development of national through-care standards via stakeholder and public consultation to improve the consistency in delivery of through-care support. This cross-cutting approach will recognise the range of services that are involved in securing good outcomes for prison leavers and will encourage them to work together. These provisions will be commenced next year, starting with the new National Third Sector Through Care Service from April, which will provide person-led and needs-centred support for people leaving prison, and for the first time will also provide support for men leaving a period of remand. Therefore, I understand and support the need for robust plans to be in place. However, these amendments, while seemingly simple, do not recognise the complexity of the services involved in providing essential support to individuals on release from prison, all of which have a wide range of duties and responsibilities, and the significant work that would be involved to implement these amendments. It would be complex, overly onerous and time-consuming on many different services to prepare one overarching plan that directs all services required for this work. The Scottish Government would have to seek detailed information from a wide range of delivery organisations across the country, many of which will be making arrangements in ways that best reflect their specific local needs and circumstances. Yes, of course.
Polly McNeill.
Thank you. And I do acknowledge the work that was done in the Bail and Release Bill. I just wondered what the Scottish Government's thinking was in relation to many prisoners who will be released a lot earlier than previously planned. And would the Cabinet Secretary accept that it is vitally important that those prisoners do have appropriate support under release? Otherwise, it's just going to be another revolving door. I know that it may sound like duplication in relation to what you're doing in relation to the Bail and Release Bill, but surely there must be some way of giving that public confidence for those who are being released quite a bit earlier from their sentence.
Always the Chair, Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I do very much understand the points that Ms McNeill makes, and if Parliament passes this bill, that gives certainty to the Scottish Prison Service and indeed our community justice and wider third sector and public sector partners, because we will therefore be able very quickly to identify the release dates and the release dates for particular prisoners. So there is time between now and the first release of those prisoners for the appropriate planning duties to take place that must indeed take place. And I suppose the nub of my concern is that we then create a system that becomes more focused on the creation of more plans as opposed to getting on and doing the work, which is about on the front line providing that support to folk as they are returned to their communities, bearing in mind that everyone impacted by this bill will indeed, sooner or later, return to their community. Presiding Officer, for those organisations themselves that are responding to the queries, I am, as I've said to Ms McNeill, concerned that that would leave them less resource available for actually providing the support to individuals required, because they would be responding to government requests to recreate one large report. And Given the crucial nature of this bill and relieving the pressure on our prison system now, we simply cannot afford to delay commencement while reports are being prepared on a vast range of services. I do provide again my reassurance that funding will be available to support the effective implementation of this bill, particularly with regard to additional costs on SPS and on local authority housing services. And I urge Parliament not to support these amendments.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I call on Pauline McNeill to wind up and to press or withdraw amendment number 13.
I'd like to press amendment 13.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 13 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. The vote is now closed. Point of order, Keith Brown.
I was unable to connect, Presiding Officer, and would have voted no.
Thank you, Mr Brown. Your vote will be recorded. The result of the vote on amendment number 13 in the name of Pauline McNeill is yes 48, no 66. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 14 in the name of Pauline McNeill, already debated with amendment 13. Pauline McNeill to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I now call amendment 15 in the name of Liam Kerr, already debated with amendment 12. Liam Kerr to move or not move?
Moved.
Moved. The question is that amendment 15 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. The vote is now closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 15 in the name of Liam Kerr is yes 48, no 70. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 16 in the name of Katie Clark, already debated with amendment 1. Pauline McNeill to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 17 in the name of Pauline McNeill, already debated with amendment 10. Pauline McNeill to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call Amendment 18 in the name of Pauline McNeill, already debated with Amendment 13. Pauline McNeill to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call Amendment 19 in the name of Pauline McNeill, already debated with Amendment 13. Pauline McNeill to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. And I call Amendment 20 in the name of Pauline McNeill, already debated with Amendment 10. Pauline McNeill to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. What I would say to members is, I think, certainly for the purposes of the front bench teams, I'm sure a short comfort break would probably be much appreciated. So I will suspend sittings for 10 minutes for a comfort break. Thank you.